Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be discussing defining the computer forensic process, section 2. I am Dr. Chanel Suggs, the Duchess of Cybersecurity, the author and instructor for this course. Today we're going to be discussing determining the inner workings of computer forensics investigation, video 1 for section 2. So when you consider the best practices and looking at the decision makers, you want to make sure that you have authorization from the decision makers when it comes to implementing policies, the procedures when it comes to handling incidents. Because these are going to be the people that implement those policies. So it's important that you're following those best practices and those policies that are implemented by those decision makers within the organization. Also, you want to make sure that notification to the decision maker is authorized whenever there is no written incident response policy as well as procedures, because you want to make sure that those decision makers are involved within those processes. Once, for example, there is an incident, you want to make sure that you receive the proper authorizations from the decision makers, and then you can look at assessing the situation and then helping to define what is going to be the best courses of actions based on that incident. So you're going to be gaining authorization from that decision maker in order to be able to conduct that investigation. You're going to make sure that you're documenting all the events as well as the decisions that occurred during that process within those incidents and looking at the incident responses. So you're creating basically something similar to a chain of custody because you're making sure that you have proper documentation so that information is relayed to those decision makers for the processes that you have taken throughout the process of conducting the investigation based on the incidents. And then also considering the scope of the incident or the absence of any national security issues, as well as when it comes to safety of life issues, you have to make sure that the first priority is always to protect the organization from further harm. But life does trump that. So you need to make sure that you have the proper measures in place, make sure that you have the proper policies implemented, and making sure that the decision maker is standing behind you and they are the ones that are implementing those policies as well as enforcing it within the organization. Because if the decision makers aren't enforcing those policies, then no one else is going to follow them. So it should always come from decision makers, basically the senior leaders, down within the organization. So when it comes to the risk assessment process, the first thing you want to do is identify whether or not there was an incident. So you want to investigate what has been determined to have caused any types of flags within the organization, determine the causes of that incident. If it was truly an incident, then you want to assess what is the damage caused to the systems, any data loss. You also want to investigate any possible affected devices as well as systems within the organization. And once you determine what those devices or systems are that was affected, you want to remove those devices as well as systems to keep them from spreading, to keep that incident from spreading within the organization and affecting other devices and systems, which could cause the organization to disrupt their overall flow of things. So when you think about it, when there's an incident, if one system is attacked or infected, it could easily spread to the next system. If it spreads to the next system, for example, if it's something that would slow down production within the organization, then this is also going to cause the organization to lose revenue. And if it's a bad enough situation, it can cause the customer, the organization, to lose clients. And if it's a data breach, for example, if it's data loss, this could be even more severe. So this is the reason why you want to make sure that you do a proper investigation on those affected devices as well as systems. Determine if this is truly an incident. Look to see if the causes of this incident has affected or damaged any services as well. Devices or systems are based on those devices or systems that are damaged. Any of those services or protocols or ports that are being used, make sure they're not being mapped to any other devices or systems within the organization that could possibly be infected as well. So you want to make sure that you do a thorough investigation on that incident within the organization. So next you want to start beginning your computer forensics toolkit. So what would you include in this toolkit? First, you're going to need a laptop, as well as, of course, the necessary operating system, as well as the patches. You want to make sure that you have the appropriate software and tools, power supplies, application media, an air card so that you can have internet access, as well as evidence collection and packaging supplies. So when you're thinking about the cables, you want to think about, for example, crossover cables, your SATA, your IDE cables, your electronic power strips as well. Tools can be, for example, your screwdrivers, just in case you have to take something apart, any types of flashlights, as well as your needle nose pliers. So within one of my past positions, one thing I always made sure I had was a proper tool set, because sometimes I would have to take systems apart. And I would have to take systems apart, for example, to sometimes replace the hardware that was there, add additional memory. For example, I did this quite often with laptops, or sometimes there could be a piece of equipment that has become faulty and needs to be replaced. So that's the reason why it's necessary that you have the proper screwdrivers, the proper tools, in order to assess any situation while you're out in the field. So when you're thinking about the software, you want to, for example, it's always a good idea to have your USB thumb drive. Have as many as possible. I would say I normally tote at least 3 with me when I travel, because you just never know. Because one can have faulty issues while you're out in the field. But I will say it's always a good idea to test your equipment before you leave. You also want to make sure you have the proper software. For example, you can have Encase, which we'll be talking about later in a few of these sections. You want to make sure that you have at least a 2 GB stick thumb drive. Most today you can get a terabyte relatively cheap, so it's all about how much you can actually spend, as well as if you're building this forensics toolkit based on your organization's funds of what they have allotted and what they have available, then you'll probably have to go with a smaller thumb drive. You also want to make sure that you have small rulers, index cards, for example, have pens, Sharpies, scissors, as well as your batteries, magnifying glasses. Make sure you have a good case, for example, a Pelican case, an organizer to sort all of your equipment out so you have it handy and ready, kind of like your go kit when you have to do a forensics assessment. You want to make sure you have dongles as well. So when I say Sharpies, for example, this is great for labeling your evidence and filling out any types of note cards. Also, when you have your note cards, you can note the custodian information, the data, the system serial number, which makes it a lot easier, and you can tag it on the outside of the back so you have the proper label information. Peel back boxes as well, getting to hold your screws when you're disassembling a laptop, for example. Your post-its, when it comes to, you can use that for labeling your drives and systems temporarily before you transfer them over to the proper location. You should always make sure you have a bootable version of each tool on a CD as well as a USB. Just in case you run into any issues while you're out in the field, this is always a good thing to have. And if you're going to be traveling, you need to make sure that the tools that you have will pass TSA checks. So you need to also consider that whenever you're doing any types of forensics assessment, especially if you're going to be flying to a customer's location. So you want to make sure that you're properly vetting what tools, software that you're going to be taking on these trips if you're going to be going to a customer site that where you're going to have to travel. For example, if you have to fly. So you can have two kits, one where you don't have to go through, for example, your TSA pre-checks, or one that you can have that you can put in your car to drive to a customer site location. So those are some things that you should consider whenever you're building your forensics toolkit. Also, you want to make sure that you have a right protected backup drives, as well as making sure you have the proper network equipment, as well as cables that I discussed earlier. So you want to make sure that you have the proper cables whenever you're going on site to any customer's location, because the last thing you want to do is be trying to do an assessment and you don't have the proper cables to connect to their systems or devices based on whatever you're using for this assessment. So when it comes to the processes that you will use within computer forensics investigations, you want to make sure that you have the proper knowledge of the standard evidence handling procedures, as well as what guidelines are going to be used, as well as understanding the tools that needs to be used as well, and maintaining the integrity of that evidence, as well as ensuring its admissibility within court. You want to make sure that as you collect that evidence, that you collect and secure it, as well as any media that is collected at the scene. You want to make sure that you're keeping all the process as well as those policy implementations, so that you make sure that you don't damage the integrity of the evidence that you have collected. Also, you want to conduct a preliminary assessment of the overall scene to determine the data requirements. You're going to look at what is the necessary investigation techniques to be used, as well as the urgency when it comes to the investigation. You want to make sure that you collect the information as well as the system information, as well as any interdependencies related to this incident. You also want to look at the operating environment. You want to make sure that you have the proper tools, for example, for password protected as well as encrypted files. For example, doing a brute force attack, looking at your dictionary attacks, using various tools that you can often find within systems like Kali. Some of the most common tools that are used today when it comes to trying to crack password are going to be your Cain and Abel, your John the Ripper. You can also use Aircrack as well as Hydra. But one of the great things about using Cain and Abel, for example, is you can use this as a great tool for network penetration testing. You can look at the LSA Secrets Dumper Service Manager, for example. You can look at the full SSH1 sessions and within a snapper. Look at a remote registry. It's also got ARP as well, cryptanalysis, as well as your 802.11 capture files decoder. And it also has a SID scanner as well as a whip cracker, hash calculator. There's so many things that you can do whenever you're using Cain and Abel. Possibilities are just limitless. You want to make sure that you're capturing relevant information for the incident. So you want to gather as much information available as possible. You want to gather names, email addresses, phone numbers. You want to determine the people that are actually there that was within the proximity of the incident that you're gathering this information. Because this will help you in the long run when it comes to your investigation. So based on the information collected Whenever you're speaking with the individuals that are within the vicinity, you can ask them questions where sometimes they won't even realize that they actually noticed something that but didn't realize that what they noticed was actually relevant. That's why it's important to make sure you're capturing those that was within the proximity of the incident or those that are actually working in that area as well, so that you can actually question them and make sure you're gathering all the necessary information that you would need to help to conduct your investigation. Whenever you're assessing a computer as well as looking at system access, you want to make sure that you're looking at the system to get names of people to access that system, getting their user IDs, timestamps. Look at what areas they accessed. Look at the processes. Look at any changes that was done by them. Review all activities. You want to make sure that you get in the place and location of every file or every item that they touch within that system, as well as making sure that you're looking at, for example, the computer as well as any types of workstations, laptops, as well as looking at any types of bring your own devices, for example. If it's connected to the organization and they have a BYOD policy in place, then that means that it's connected into their network, which means that they probably access stuff in that manner too. So you want to make sure that you're verifying and double checking with every area that they could have possibly accessed if it was part of the incident that you are investigating. You want to make sure that you follow the chain of custody as well as search systems for any relevant data using keywords as well as phrases that could be a part of the incident that occurred within the organization. When it comes to the chain of custody, this is basically the history of the collection process, which tells you how the evidence has collected, analyzed, transported, and preserved. So whenever someone is conducting the chain of custody, it should establish a thorough process, which means taking notes, including any type of documentation when it comes to recovery locations, the time and date recovered or received, as well as descriptions of those items. What was the condition? Any unusual markings, as well as any types of alterations to that particular item that was collected. Making sure you're marking and packaging that evidence properly, and then sealing the evidence and preparing the full record for the chain of custody. So whenever you're looking at the record for the chain of custody, all items at the scene must include a unique identifier, the description, as well as the person who collected the item, the date and time of the collection, as well as the location of where it was found. So how do you maintain an accurate and complete chain of custody? You limit the number of people that are accessing and handling this evidence. You confirm the names as well as those identification information, as well as the numbers, the dates that are listed on the chain of custody documents. You ensure that all the evidence is packaged properly, sealed, and marked prior to any type of submission. And you also obtain signed or secure receipts upon transfer of any type of evidence. So it's important to preserve the evidence from time of collection to the courtroom. You need to make sure that all evidence is identified, inventoried, and secured to preserve its integrity, because if the integrity is not preserved, then it will not be admissible within a court of law. So this includes, as I noted before, effective evidence preservation when it comes to appropriate packaging, noting the correct information, also considering the biological effects when it comes to packaging, memorizing any types of degradations. Also consider if you got liquid samples, you got to think about how you're going to properly store those as well. making sure you have the proper measures in place. These are just a few things that you must consider when it comes to the chain of custody, making sure that you have everything documented, ensuring proper transportation, and preserving the evidence until it is presented within a court of law. So when it comes to the methodology that is used for computer forensic investigation, the first step is to obtain a search warrant. So whenever destruction of evidence is going to be imminent, then a warrant seizure of that evidence is going to be justifiable. So otherwise, you need to make sure that you have that warrant. It's only when it comes to imminent danger that a warrant isn't necessary for a seizure, because you're trying to get that evidence before it has been compromised or destroyed. So you want to make sure that you evaluate the scene. You also want to collect the evidence, make sure that the evidence is secure, making sure you're gathering the preliminary information at the scene, such as the date, the time, what was the place and the location, looking at the evidence from volatile to non-volatile systems, as well as details for the people that are there at the scene, names and identifications as well. Noting the first person that was at the scene, that you should collect their information as well as preserve it as much as possible, making sure that you're following those laws and procedures. Also, securing the evidence and transport, as we discussed before with the chain of custody. So whenever you're collecting information or evidence, you want to make sure that you list the systems. You want to record the extent of the system's clock drift, for example, and you want to obtain the relevant order of validity when it comes to the data. You want to make sure that you're capturing the electronic serial number of that drive, as well as making sure you have write, protect, as well as virus check for the media, for maintaining and ensuring that you have integrity of that media. You want to make sure that you're following proper guidelines when it comes to acquiring the evidence, making sure that you have for example, a forensically clean storage device whenever you're trying to capture the evidence. When it comes to securing the evidence, making sure that you're operating in a manner that it doesn't damage the evidence integrity. Making sure that the evidence is going to be in a secure site. Ensuring it won't be accessible by intruders. Maintaining that chain of custody. Looking at identifying any types of digital as well as non-digital artifacts when it comes to the evidence based on the behavior. Maintaining a logbook, for example, regarding the entrance to the lab to log in, when it comes to timings as well as the names of the persons or people that visited the evidence that you have within your chambers. Placing, for example, monitors within the overall facility to ensure that the evidence you gathered is secure. Making sure that you have proper management when it comes to protecting the temperament of that evidence, as well as making sure you archive it by properly handling as well as the documentation. Making sure of evidence transfer from the sender as well as the receiver. Making sure you're getting the proper information, as we noted multiple times regarding the chain of custody. Making sure the date, the information, the time of transfer. Making sure you have proper procedures in place when it comes to protecting that evidence as well as documentation. So when it comes to trying to analyze the data, this is where you're going to be looking at more of trying to conduct analysis on that data, where you can be duplicating the data, for example, understanding that the copy of the data is the only one that you can forensically touch and try to see if you can gather additional information. You cannot change anything on the actual evidence that is collected, because that violates the integrity of the evidence that you have collected. Verifying the image integrity as well, for example, of that evidence using hash value tools, for example, using tools or applications in order to recover the data. These are all things that we will talk about later as we go through the course. So you want to make sure you assess and evaluate, prepare a report, as well as prepare for expert testimony. So what are some of the best practices when it comes to assessing that evidence? Reviewing the file names for relevance patterns, looking at correlation when it comes to file headers, to those corresponding files, looking at the extensions, as well as identifying any types of possible mismatches, reviewing the time as well as the date stamps within those files, within the metadata, analyzing the physical as well as the logical evidence, also examining the network service logs as well as the events of interest, examining host data, especially large amounts, looking at the portion of the data that can lead you to information that's going to be relevant to that incident, looking at offline analysis on a bitwise copy of the original evidence. As noted, you never mess with the original evidence because that changes the integrity. Searching the contents of all the files that you've gathered in order to help to identify any files that could be of interest. So whenever you're looking at the overall documentation phase, assessing the data, so you're looking at the initial estimate of impact based on the situation to the organization, looking at your interviews that you conducted as well as your system administrators, any outcomes when it comes to legal or third-party interactions, looking at your logs as well as your reports that you created when you were using the tools as we discussed before, and proposing what is going to be that course of action that the organization should take. So when you're looking at acquiring that data, you're creating a check-in and a check-out basically list when it comes to the information such as the name of the person that's going to be examining the evidence, the exact dates as well as the times, analyzing that data. You're going to be documenting the information such as making sure that you're noting it with the number and types of operating systems that it actually has on there, noting the file contents, noting the results or the correlation of those files that you pulled earlier that we discussed, as well as documenting any types of configurations of those users. As you're going through this process, you want to make sure that you identify any of the documentation or any of the information that has been gathered that was relevant to the overall investigation. You want to form your facts to support your conclusions based on the evidence that you have gathered. You want to make sure that you have a list of evidence that was collected as well, and you want to make sure that you include that in the report for the organization. This is also going to be presentable within the court of law. You want to make sure that your reports reflect the information that you have gathered or the evidence that you have collected. Organize the information and classify the information to ensure that it's clear and concise to make it a lot easier for those that will be reading your report later. Making sure that you're noting a detailed description of that evidence that was collected, noting the type of analysis that you did, the methods that you used, what was those procedures. Also including any types of proofs of your findings, summarizing your overall outcome, as well as citing any specific evidence that you can use that can actually prove your conclusion based on the evidence that you have collected within that organization. Making sure that you have supporting documents there as well, such as background information regarding that report, such as looking at, for example, network diagrams that describes the computer investigation, noting the different areas that you assessed and what you found based on those systems, and within each one to give them an overall idea and view of the investigative process. So it makes it where they can actually understand what was conducted, how the information was gathered, how you came to your conclusions, so that they have a better understanding of the overall investigative process. This concludes this section on determining the inner workings of computer forensic investigation. Within this video, we went through some best practices, especially as it relates to decision makers. We also went through the risk assessment processes. Building a computer forensics toolkit, what you should include, what you should be looking for, and why is it necessary to have these pieces within your toolkit. We also went over the process for a computer forensic investigation, understanding what evidence handling procedures should be, as well as collecting and securing the evidence, those processes and policies that you would need to follow to prevent any types of damages. We also discuss collecting relevant information based on the people that are there in regards to this incident that's within the vicinity, reviewing your computer and system access, as well as making sure you follow the chain of custody, as well as getting you to understand what is the chain of custody and how does it apply to you as a forensic examiner. We also went through the computer forensics investigation methodology. Up next, we'll be going through understanding cyber laws. That is going to be video 2 for section 2.